HVAC 360, episode number 76. Comfy by Building Robotics, AHR Expo 2014. Hey, welcome back, everybody, to another episode of HVAC 360. I am your host, as always, Matt Nelson. This week, we're going to be talking to somebody that I met at the AHR Expo in New York City. Lindsay Baker, who is the VP of Business Development for Building Robotics, was showing off her product at the show called Comfy. I guess what really struck me as I saw it was, obviously with lead and different things that you're going through, building comfort surveys is something that you occasionally run into. And that seemed to be what this product was about. So I stopped by and talked a little bit about it with Lindsay. And, I guess another thing that really stuck out in my head was the fact that this is really kind of a Web 2.0 kind of thing. And in an industry that really isn't known for its progressive, cutting edge technology, this seemed, really out there. It seemed like it was, hey, look at me. It looked slick. The operation of it was really interesting, and the concept was very bold, I should say. It wasn't business as usual. So I talked with her and got some good information. So this was a follow-up interview that I did. I did an interview on the show floor. But we caught up with her back in California, and we had a conversation. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Lindsay Baker. All right, today we're going to be talking with Lindsay Baker, who is the VP of Business Development for Building Robotics. How are we doing this morning, Lindsay?
Doing good, thanks.
So you represent a company, Building Robotics. Now, we're going to talk about Building Robotics. We're going to talk about the product called Comfy. But can you tell me a little bit about, what Building Robotics does and what kind of the superhero origin story of them?
Sure. Yeah, I do actually sometimes feel like at least my co-founders are superheroes. I met Andrew and Steve, who started the company about a year and a half ago. They're computer scientists coming out of UC Berkeley. They were doing their PhDs there, and I was doing my PhD as well. Mine is in building science, and we met sort of as they were coming to the end of their program and really understanding this new opportunity in the building sector. As computer scientists, they're really interested in taking opportunities of, where are there lots of sensors and actuators and data out there in the world that really aren't being used to their full potential, and how can we use them? It's sort of that Internet of Things trend in a way that looks at connecting the physical world. So they sort of stumbled upon this idea of buildings and how building management systems in particular have a lot of data that they're collecting. They're doing a lot of stuff. They are, very much computers, but they're sort of computers that tend to be stuck a little bit in, around 1995 in terms of the technology that's really being utilized there. And so they got really interested in why that was, started the company. The name sort of relates more to the idea that robotics is this field where you are trying to enable computers to do things that humans would have done previously, usually involving some sort of learning over time. So, computers are getting better at what we call machine learning, or otherwise artificial intelligence, some people call it. And they were really interested in that aspect of how do you bring artificial intelligence and machine learning to commercial buildings specifically. So a little bit similar to what Nest does in the residential market, but this one, what we've focused on is more on commercial space, office space, that kind of thing. So we met, and I was actually working with Google at the time and saw what they were doing, thought it was really exciting, We got the company funded. We're a venture-backed software startup. We started about a year ago, really kind of getting off the ground and doing a set of pilots. And so far it's been going great. We've grown to a team of 10 people, and we're really getting all of the proof out there now that we've got a bunch of good pilots. So it's been a really interesting ride. As someone, my background is more building performance, diagnostics, sustainability, that kind of thing. And starting a company has been pretty fun process. So yeah, we're having a good time. It certainly feels, we have plenty of days that feel pretty heroic.
So now, I mean, you mentioned a couple of different, I don't know, catchphrases, like different things, Internet of Things. You know, I mean, if you, and this is more for the listeners of various different, I guess, technical backgrounds. We're going to be talking about things that are a little bit more advanced. The Internet of Things is kind of one of those catchphrases nowadays that, as you described, it refers to everything seems to be connected from, your toaster to your microwave to your, even, your house, your security system, your, cameras. Everything seems to be connected to the internet. And you can, it's like there's an app for that. Is the common thing where you can interact with these at a distance to be able to do things that you'd not necessarily able to do in the past. Am I getting that correct?
You are, yeah, for sure. And I think one of the things, it's sometimes it's hard to envision what the real future looks like when it comes to the notion that the internet was very much this first step of connecting people and ideas and services and economies all together, into this network. And things, the broad title of things, still tend to be fairly disconnected. But, the sort of easy one is people say things like, I go to the grocery store and I don't know if I ran out of eggs. I don't remember. Could my fridge tell me that I ran out of eggs, or I've still got 6 eggs in my fridge? There's a lot of little things like that we'll be able to do, but it's just the very beginning of imagining a world where we have a lot more intelligence just about the things in our space. And I think where it gets pretty exciting, at least from my perspective, is when it really gets back to issues of sustainability and good resource use. We're really getting to that point, especially with the Internet of Things. Some of the first technologies that have really taken off are ones where we're saying, hey, this light bulb doesn't need to be on if no one's there. That kind of stuff is pretty obvious, but is taking a little bit of time to make a smart light bulb, to make a smart thermostat, to make a smart toaster. So who knows where it'll take us, but there's definitely a lot of opportunity in that, and it's been fun to be sort of in Silicon Valley experiencing everyone starting to have these new ideas about where you might see that kind of technology, that ecosystem go.
Right. And I like the fact that, you mentioned the, am I out of eggs? It's like, it's always, it's these things that you're like, would that ever happen? It's like people like your toaster is connected. You're like, why would my toaster ever need to be connected to the internet? It's the most kind of, mundane things, but other things that are popping up that make a little bit more sense are, like, is my garage door closed? It's like, I don't know how many times I'm leaving the house and I'm talking to my wife and she's like, did we close the garage door? And I'm like, there should be an app for that. Okay, let's just check. Yes, it's closed. Oh, no, it's not closed. Okay, close it. Hit the button.
Yeah.
But
yeah, it's interesting. I think one of the things we've learned is that a lot of technologies in Silicon Valley do kind of start with the phrase, "Wouldn't it be cool if?" ... And and that's amazing that we live in a culture where that kind of technology gets developed because someone thinks it would be cool. Mm-hmm. And it's really fun to watch those things. We're a little bit more focused on, someone really needs this thing, and, we're going to enable this, something that used to be just an object is now going to have some intelligence built into it because people really need it to be that way. I mean, certainly healthcare and those kinds of applications are big ones. But yeah, I mean, coming back to the office, I think one of the things we're seeing is that there is wouldn't it be cool if you walk into your office and the lights dim to the level that you like them and the temperature goes where you want it to be and the shades pull down and the window opens just to the right level and, you know, and your favorite music starts playing and whatever, the machine makes you a coffee. There's all these things, right, that it would be cool. But at the larger level, there's a lot of wasted energy, a lot of wasted resources that go into offices, and a lot of the intelligence I think that we're first seeing come out is just targeted at getting people to be able to save money through a more intelligent, save money, save resources, save, you know, environmental impact. Right. Making smarter choices about those kinds of things.
Yeah. No, I mean, you had mentioned Nest, and for anybody who doesn't know, they should, you know, Google Nest and figure out exactly what it is. But, you know, that was really kind of focusing on the home market, being able to, you know, save energy, being able to track, you know, who's in the house, what are some of the usages. But that is, you know, it seems it's easy. You know, obviously, the home kind of environment is a very simplified, you know, envelope of, you know, there's only so many, you know, interactions that happen. But when you take that into an office building, you know, it just grows exponentially. Especially when you're talking about, you know, the data points where, you know, a lot of people don't know. You know, everything is wired up. I mean, more and more things, whether it be outlets, whether it be light switches, whether it be, you know, and the building automation system has always been there. But there's a lot of data points that are floating around already in the you know, buildings today. So yeah, I know that. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I was just going to say, I mean, it's both the curse and the blessing of what we do compared to what a residential home looks like. You know, we have a ton of information, a ton of people, a ton of, you know, people who care about the temperature, who are sitting there in their desk all day. There's a lot of energy to sort of be harnessed there in the office environment. In residential, you know, Nest really got a lot of their traction from things like vacation homes, where people like the idea that they, you know, can keep their heating and cooling down until a few hours before they arrive, you know, and it started there and it kind of went out. It's a little bit of an easier thing, but I think homes are still really important, but it is kind of, it's been, I think we've certainly found many ways where we're jealous of the simplicity, you know, but comfy, I guess, to sort of start to get into a little bit of what we do. When we looked at the commercial environment, really office environments primarily to start with, you obviously, I think, you know, HVAC engineers will know that typically people share a temperature in commercial space, whether through, you know, in an open office area, they'll have usually a variable air volume box supplying a particular area. Maybe it's 10 people, maybe it's 15, maybe it's 20. And all of those people probably have a slightly different sense of what they like in terms of temperature. And they have to share one temperature, typically speaking. So when we looked at doing this, I think one of the hypotheses that we've really been testing over the past year is, will people find a way to kind of share a temperature in a more collaborative and friendly way to give them the right tools to do so? And that's what we've created with Comfy. So far it's been really exciting to see how well that's worked as a hypothesis. And I think it's surprising to a lot of people, but once you kind of get into the details of what we did, I think it starts to make sense that something like this, that the way that you present it to people on the sort of behavioral psychology side especially, is pretty key to getting that interaction just right. You know, we do in the office space share a lot of things already, but temperature has usually been something that's been hard for people to share, typically because they don't really understand how it works. And, you know, it's a little bit, and also because mechanical systems and thermostats haven't really been designed in a way that's particularly conducive to how people really experience temperature. So we've been trying to work on that with Comfy to really kind of improve that whole interaction. Yeah.
And just to be clear, Comfy is your essentially a product, your service.
Yeah, exactly. So Comfy, so Building Robotics is the name of the company, and Comfy is the name of our product that we have right now out on the market, which is essentially it's essentially an intelligent thermostat for office space. It's a personalized temperature control. There's lots of ways you can think about it. But what we do is we plug into the existing building management system in commercial buildings with all of the zones and everything laid out there. And we basically provide occupants with a very clean, nicely designed interface that allows them to interact with the temperature in their space. So it's very carefully done. We're not actually allowing them to sort of pick a temperature, say, I want it to be 68 degrees all the time in here. What we do is we have 3 simple buttons. We have warm my space, cool my space, and I'm comfortable. And occupants choose one of those 3 when they go into the interface. They select their location on a map first, which we just sort of get from the building owner or someone, mechanical drawings, those kinds of things. They select their location on a map. They click one of those 3 buttons. And then we actually do 2 things after they click. The first is we send them 10 minutes of warm or cool air, depending on their request. Sometimes, depending on how the VAEs are done, it's just a little bit of a reduction in airflow. But typically, it'll be a little burst of cool or warm air. We send that to them right as they click. So that's the first sort of big thing. Occupants really are losing trust with the notion that thermostats do anything in office space. I think that they've caught on to the trend of dummy thermostats and the fact that people don't necessarily want them to be using any temperature control. So this is already something that tends to be pretty cool for people when they first experience it, that they have this higher level of real control in their hands. And they access they access Comfy through a website. It's typically a website that can either be on their internal network for a corporation, corporate network type of thing, or it can be just in the cloud. We also have an iPhone app. So people will click one of those 3 buttons. They get that immediate stream of warm or cool air, but then we don't necessarily change the set point because of that. Instead, what we do is over time, we use all of those inputs to put into this machine learning system that starts to optimize all of the zones based on people's votes over time, based on the time of day, the day of the week, the temperature that they voted at, that kind of thing, where they were, of course. And what we're trying to do is to really tune each zone to the vote patterns of people in that zone. So if, a group of people on a floor gets in at 6 a.m. and another group gets in at 10 a.m., say it's, the finance folks and the IT folks, something like that, then Comfy is going to learn to reduce conditioning in the space that isn't occupied until 10 a.m. because it's not going to see any sort of usage there. So it's very much based on the notion that people are going to, click and express their opinions, which we do really see in pretty incredible numbers. We get a lot of persistent use over time. It's been really fun to watch that happen. And where there aren't any clicks in any particular zones, a lot of times it'll be corridors or bike rooms or, copy rooms, things like that. When no one clicks in those zones, it means that we're actually going to keep those zones with the maximum temperature allowable given to us from the building manager. So typically, those are dead bands of more like 8 to 10 degrees. So because there's no one sitting in the copy room all the time, you can keep the conditioning a little bit less precise in those areas. And that in of itself gets a lot of energy savings. basically, I think we're seeing something like 25% of the zones are not really occupied, generally speaking. And so perhaps the lack of votes in there means that we can keep it, a little bit, something more like 68 to 78, oftentimes, things like that. So that's kind of how we start to save energy, which is a real advantage for people who are interested in trying to cut down on those bills. And it's one of those rare win-wins where, because technology is now allowing us to do something a little bit more finely tuned to people's behavior and people's preferences, we really do reduce conditioning instead of increasing it because of all of the opportunities where people really don't actually want, the 70 to 72 degree office space. So that's the basics of how it works. I think there's probably a lot more. We started to get at sharing. I think the biggest things that people tend to ask are what happens if I'm in a zone and I want it warmer and my neighbor wants it cooler. It's the biggest part of our design process, really. So what we've done there is a few things. The first is when you go to click through the map, and you can actually go to our website at buildingrobotics.com and kind of see this. Also, actually, I guess by the time this airs, gocomfy.com will be up and running. So that's an even better place to go.
What was that?
GoComfy.
Oh, gocomfy.com?
Yeah. That's
okay.
Sort of a little bit more for the for comfy specifically. So you can check out kind of how this looks visually. But basically, when you first go in and you're selecting your location on a map, you actually see all of the zones laid over the map. So for an occupant, that's the first time they've seen something like that. They've never known who they shared a temperature with. They might have had an idea of it, but they've never actually seen that before. So it's a big moment for them to understand, a really important moment for them to kind of get that sense of how they're sharing a temperature. And typically what we see is that's sort of the first critical step in them knowing that if they make a request, it impacts other people. The second thing that we do is we actually show who has voted in the zone. So all the occupants can see who has voted in their zone most recently and what they voted and when they voted. So it's real transparency there instead of sort of the thermostat wars that you see in offices where someone will run up when no one's looking and, crank it to cold, and then someone else will go and, a few minutes later when that person's gone to a meeting and crank it back down. But, this is really aimed at having people understand that, everyone cares about this. And then we also have one last thing we do called the buddy mode, where you actually, if you have a particularly large zone, you can turn this on. It takes two people to actually send the immediate response. That's a little bit like a nuclear warhead in that sense. You sort of have to have both keys to do it. So there's a lot of little things you can do to get that all to work well. But generally speaking, I think now we're having Comfy run in thousands of zones, and I think we've got probably maybe one or two where people vote differently at the same time of day. It's really rare, as it turns out, and people find that very surprising. I think especially HVAC engineers find that very surprising. But it's important to remember that this is not just a matter of the diversity of people, but also the diversity of time. So one person might be hot in the afternoon, the other person is cold in the morning. We can handle that. That's something that Comfy can take care of. So it's tended to be a lot of things like that, generally speaking.
Right, and I think in general, when you're thinking about design, you don't have the funds to give everybody their own thermostat, so you end up grouping people is what ends up happening. Now, when I first saw your product, I'm thinking, hey, it's a slick interface. It's just, it's one of those things you're like, oh, that's gorgeous. That's, it's kind of like, the iPhone and the interface and it's all kind of, that Web 2.0, but you're really looking at, I guess the first thing that popped into my mind was comfort surveys. I'm in dealing with lead projects, you're like, okay, is this sort of like a comfort survey to be able to determine, if a system is operating or not. So I guess how do you compare the two, comfy and comfort surveys?
Yeah, absolutely. So interestingly, I actually did my master's work on comfort surveys, so a little bit of background in that for sure. So I think I have a little soft spot in my heart for them. I think they're a great way to gather at least some sort of baseline information about your building. One of the things we found, I did my research at the Center for the Built Environment at UC Berkeley, which is where a lot of comfort survey research has come out of. And one of the things that you find is that you do learn a lot from surveys, typically comparative stuff. So if you do surveys over the course of a group of buildings, you'll oftentimes find the building that maybe has some of the biggest issues, by just comparison, what people wrote in one building versus the other. But they are just one point in time. And typically what we find about people and their thermal comfort preferences is it's actually a little bit hard for people to remember accurately how they felt in space. It's an interesting thing, but we do certainly see that. If you sort of think about, was there any time yesterday when you were too warm or too cool? Typically, unless it got really bad, you probably don't remember. That, or also people, if they did get very cold or very hot on one day, a week before, they might remember that the whole week was cold or hot because that was such an acute experience for them. So there's a lot of ways that those kinds of things can be a little hard to learn from accurately. With Comfy, we are getting a lot more information for sure. It's a little bit more dynamic in that way. And that's fun. But I think the real critical part is that it is very hard. It's hard for a typical chief engineer to keep up, or, their team to keep up with the dynamic nature of people's temperature preferences. We really do like things differently. If you come in from outside and it's, a little bit hotter out and maybe you were just running around a bit, you're going to want it cooler, but you really only need it cooler for about 10 minutes and then your metabolic rate goes down, et cetera. So it's an interesting thing. We do gather the data and I think it's very, useful in of itself. But the fact that we are acting on it as it's coming in, but in a way that building managers are comfortable with, because it's ultimately still within the bounds of, a range that they agree to, and it's all in the name of comfort. So it means that their hot and cold calls typically are pretty much eliminated. It's really a way of handling those issues in a way that, you do learn a lot. We certainly learn a ton about what people's temperature preferences are in the same way that you would with a survey. But it's also just much more dynamic, much more satisfying, I think, to the end user than the survey.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess I look at comfort surveys a lot too. That you're kind of trying to identify areas like problem areas, whereas it seems that Comfy, at least to me, is trying to address more of a productivity type of mentality, where you're saying, okay, I'm hot, I'm cold, I don't like this, so I want it hotter, warmer, and then have that change, which normally, if you got the hot and cold complaints like you're saying, what that really means is somebody's hot or cold, they call down to the building manager or the building operations guy or whoever, and they will adjust the set point. They'll do something weird, but that temporary change that stems from that call could propagate. It could never get changed back. And I think where your system excels is that it will momentarily just say, okay, here you go. You got what you wanted. that you didn't have to bother the maintenance guy. And, if it continues to be problematic, you're going to start picking up on that. And that's when you can really address it. Did I get that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly what we're aiming for. And it really is something that, from our experience, building managers are pretty interested in doing because, like you said, that dynamic of oftentimes they're not going to go back and change the set point if they change it one time. We see that all the time when we go to launch Comfy in new buildings. There are set points that have been, left somewhere that they were, and no one really remembers, and the occupants have moved in and out, and all of that. It's just hard to keep track of that kind of thing.
Yeah.
That's absolutely what we see, and I think it's also, I will say, one of the things that Comfy has been helpful though with, which has been fun to see, is that there are actually a lot of moments when we find faults or other issues with the building, miscalibrated thermostats, things like that, because we're able to use people as sensors, and they actually are really good at that. And many times, there was one building I think we launched in a while back actually, where the occupants for the first couple of weeks of having Comfy, they were clicking really frequently in this one room that it was too cold all the time. But our system, the BMS, was showing that it was 74, 75 degrees. That seemed a little strange to us. So we asked the manager to go to take a look, and he looked, and it turned out that the thermostat was miscalibrated. It was actually 68 degrees in there. And really, it was picked up very fast because the occupants, unlike when someone might call with a hot and cold request, this is something when you get to see that pattern much faster with a larger group of people. And that really helps you know that there's probably an issue there. So it's something where we're able to kind of help identify those types of faults, hopefully a little bit quicker and with a little bit more reliability than what you might have otherwise going on. The occupants can really they like to be the eyes and ears of the building as long as they sort of think there's something that they get out of it. So that's typically what we've seen so far. So it has been helpful, I think, also in identifying some of those problem areas. We like to think of ourselves as a company that really offers comfort as a service. So, we actually do walk through with our customers when we find things. These folks are saying that it's really too cold in their space, and there's not a whole lot that the VAV can do to warm it up because they're underneath a huge supply plenum. And it's kind of the air, the way that the convection is working in the space, it's just making them too cold. So, hey, maybe there's something different we need to do here. So we like to really help our clients understand how they can achieve that higher level of comfort. I think it's also worth saying for HVAC engineers, folks who are trying to encourage their clients to go towards DVC controls, smaller zones, smaller zoning, all of those things that HVAC engineers typically like to do. This is one of those, Comfy can be one of those reasons that owners can really grab onto that those kinds of things are worth an investment because they see it a lot more visibly in their world, in their day-to-day and in their employees' day-to-day. When you have Comfy, it just sort of you start to notice those things a lot more. So that's been kind of a cool advantage because we really believe in, smaller zones and DVC controls and all of those kinds of things that are the next generation of HVAC. Or, really just best practices in many ways in HVAC design. So, Comfy can help in that way to really to sell those things because it's a little bit more visible.
Now, I guess, if somebody's uncomfortable in a space, and this gets back to the operation of how Comfy works, they have 3 buttons they can choose. What's to prevent them from just saying, I'm cold, and then clicking on it again, and I'm really cold, and just, trying to be the squeaky wheel here?
Mm-hmm. So, we have our super users. We have folks who use it. We have Comfy every day, a couple times a day sometimes, depending on how it works. So they can use that in that way. if they want to be the squeaky wheel, it's okay. What ends up happening is we don't like that to happen because we think that they're going to get the zone down below the temperature that we want them to. Well, that won't happen. There's a limit that they can go to, or up, if they want it warmer. And then also we're worried about energy savings is another reason. We don't really want to be taxing the system and, using too much energy. What we find is that because of that, it's what it is we design for the full diversity of how people actually function in space. So if we were designing for the squeaky wheels, probably if we had a building full of squeaky wheels, it might not work that well. But even if you think you have a building full of squeaky wheels, you probably feel like that some days if you're a chief engineer. But generally speaking, we have, I think, probably somewhere in the order of 2% maybe or fewer of our occupants that are using Comfy are clicking, once a day or more. So when you think about how much those people, and then you think about those people in comparison to the 25% of states that never see the Comfy vote, the energy savings are really still there considerably. Even if you have a zone that's kind of working a little bit harder to keep it cooler, or they do like to push the button a lot. Ultimately, it's fine. It really shakes out in the wash.
So, what do the building owners, the operators, what kind of interface do they see? I mean, it's a very simplified for the users, but when you get to the building operators, what does that look like?
Yeah, great question. So, for the building managers, we do show them an interface that looks a little bit like a building management system in the sense that it's a map-based. We have one aspect of it is a map-based interface where they can click on different zones and see how people have been voting, see what Comfy thinks the deadband should be at that time. Really, gets into some details there. So they've got a lot of information that they can see there. They also can see who has been voting. They can look at a little live dashboard that tells them who voted that day and what they voted. So they do have the visibility there, and they can really. We've actually had a couple of clients at this point who have said that they're interested in trying to place people in space a little bit more according to their personal preferences, which should be cool. I think we'll see how that goes moving forward. But the general idea is a pretty neat one, which is that now that you kind of can see people's tendencies, you might be able to find a place that they find more comfortable than the place that they might be sitting now. Obviously, for the more dynamic, flexible workspaces, but that is something that you could probably get out of the back-end interface. And there's a few other things that you can see there, but that's the basic gist of it. We try to make it really low profile. Facility managers, in my experience, don't always want to deal with a new interface. They don't want to have to go in and use it every day or anything like that. They've got a lot of things on their hands, and new software tools are a dime a dozen. So we try to really minimize what people need to do there in the interface. They can continue to use their BMS for all of their zone overrides and maintenance downtimes and things like that. That's all still, you would still do that in your main BMS.
So where do you have Comfy, installed already? I mean, obviously it's a new startup. You have an installation base. Where have those been currently? Yeah. So we've actually been very fortunate to have kind of an interesting cross-section of companies and groups that have been using Comfy so far. So we started at UC Berkeley, so we have a campus building there that's sort of a classroom, an office space. Now we are in a good handful of buildings that range from sort of the tech companies around here where we're based in Oakland. They're mostly down in Silicon Valley. We've worked, we're in the Green Proving Grounds that the General Services Administration, the GSA, has. So we've been running a test building for them, which has been really exciting. So that is mostly exciting, I think, because we'll have this great report that will come out at the end of that pilot
that Oak Ridge National Labs is writing on a full evaluation with sort of independent evaluation there about how comfy impacts occupants and energy use and all those things. We also have been working with Johnson Controls, which has been fun. So we have we're in their headquarters space in Milwaukee. And then we have a nice handful of other buildings and folks that have been starting to try it out as well that are mechanical engineering firms. We've got one going now, a design firm, a landlord where they're actually paying for their tenants to have comfy, which has been great. So there's a lot there. There's a lot there that's different, very different actually. Many of our clients come from kind of different perspectives, which is cool. We really like that. But yeah, it's a interesting diversity. But over the past year, we've really just been focused primarily on making sure that we get these first buildings really thoroughly assessed and learn a lot from them. This is our, sort of phase where we try to gather a lot of data and make sure that we're tuning everything exactly the way we want and adding the right features. So that group has been really helpful in that, and we'll have some case studies coming out soon that talk a little bit more about all of those installations and the data that we got out of those in terms of energy savings and usage patterns and those kinds of things.
So are you focusing currently, I mean, obviously a lot of the spaces that you talked about really are office buildings. You're talking about spaces that, are offices, open office areas, things like that. Is that your main, I guess,
Yeah. It has been our main area so far. We started there, I think, partially because it's certainly a big portion of where a lot of folks spend their time when they're working, and there's a lot of need there that was pretty clear. But we've also started to talk about going into spaces like hospitals, which tend to be medical office buildings as well, that have a lot of issues around the individuals in each space having particular preferences and it's changing over time and needing to be a little bit more sensitive to their needs. So certainly sensitive to folks like nurses who are coming and going, trying to change the thermostats all the time. Apparently that's a big issue in healthcare settings. So looking at that kind of thing, we're looking at a few other kinds of opportunities. I think, generally speaking, we could go into any building that had a building management system and wanted to do something that was more of a zone level control, personal interaction type of service. So we're open to talking to folks about different kinds of things as well.
So now, I guess I go back 2 steps. When we're talking about, the integration into the building automation system, I can see this being kind of a sensitive subject to people. I guess how do you, interact with that? I mean, how do you technically,
Sure. Yeah. So we try to be really sensitive to that. So there's a couple things that we do. So I should say, first of all, we can plug into all the main building management systems out there that people tend to use. We're pretty much, I think we've gotten through almost all of them now that we've had a deployment with. So, Johnson Controls, Metasys, ALC, Siemens, Schneider Electric, Allison, etc. So when we go into those buildings, typically what we're doing is we're overriding the zone level set point. So we really don't do anything with the central systems at all. We're just changing zone level controls, and it's typically just the set point during the sort of the maximum and minimum deadband set point. Sometimes those are configured in different ways, but that's the basics. Sometimes during the blast, we do override the airflow temporarily as well, so that set point will change. But what we do is we run at the lowest backnet priority level. So we're always, if you need to override or turn off the system, it's very easy to do that. It's also very easy to turn the zone off, to change the permissions for any given zone. We have we've been very careful to sort of provide lots of options, lots of flexibility there. So typically what we see is that folks will want to try it out in a small space just to start to see what it does, and that's totally fine with us. So we can facilitate that, where basically you just plug in Comfy and kind of see what it's doing on the back end and watch it, and not even launch it to occupants yet, but just kind of check it out and see how it works. So we try to be really sensitive to the fact that this is something that people aren't used to having a machine do for them. But ultimately, that is what we're doing. It's just the deadband temperature set point for each zone. Nothing central system related at all.
Right. So if something happens with Comfy for whatever reason, it's still at the lowest priority level. So we'll just go back to the default settings of what it was controlling to before.
Exactly. If for some reason our box got unplugged or you lost power and it came back on again, those kinds of things. Yeah, it'll all just revert back to the original settings, and we'll just work on getting it back at your convenience.
So getting down into the nitty gritty, the nuts and bolts, you just referred to the box, and I'm just kind of fascinated about obviously I think a bunch of people understand the building architecture where you'll basically have all the devices reporting back to a central controller that's handling the building automation system. That's where the brains, the programming, everything like that resides. And you have a separate device that is, physically connected into that, communicating with that. Am I getting that right?
So, exactly. So we can do it in different ways. Again, we try to be flexible there. So what we tend to do is we have a little box that's just basically a computer, a small sort of a hard drive-based computer, and it plugs in via an Ethernet cable to the machine that's running the building management system. I like to use reasons, but that's the basics. So then that box is to the necessary data that runs Comfy into our into the piece that the management interface runs on. So that's basically how that works. We can also do a system that has where we actually put our software onto the building management system computer. So that's a possibility as well.
Okay. Now, as far as feedback that you get from the users, what have some of your clients talked about?
Yeah, sure. It's really fun. I think for me, especially coming from a background of doing a lot of energy kinds of projects in the past with buildings, I've never had people come up to me and say, "Thank you, you changed my life." But that's probably the extreme of how people experience something. For a lot of people, office temperature and them just sort of sitting at their desk all day, not really being able to do anything about it. We have a lot of people who used to, wear blankets at work and things, coming and telling us how happy they are. So that's been really fun. We also do see, we've got a lot of data that we've been collecting just about how the usage patterns look. So somewhere around 75% of people who have access to Comfy do sign up and use it. And then it splits, depending on the client, it splits somewhere roughly into thirds of people. The first third is folks who use it more than once a week, pretty frequently, and they seem to be pretty reliable that way. Then we have a group of people who use it occasionally, more than once a month. Maybe they're going to a conference room and it feels a little bit chilly in there, something like that. And then we have folks who used it once or twice when they first heard about it and haven't gone back to use it. So we obviously survey those folks and find out a little bit of what is going on with them. And so far it seems like they're just the type of people who say they don't really care too much about the temperature. They think it's cool, but someone else is using Comfy in their zone who they trust, and they, and they just leave it up to them, and, they're not too picky. So those are the kinds of ways that the usage breaks out. And yeah, typically we don't have very many zones that have gone into buddy mode. Buddy mode is something we just turn on when we see a lot of people voting in one zone. And, we just turn it on for good measure, but probably somewhere around, 10 zones, 10, 15 zones out of the thousands that we have now that are actually using it. So it's really, tends to be pretty harmonious in that way. We've also been really happy with how the facility managers have found it. We had one gentleman who we worked with to get Comfy up and running. He said it took him 6 hours total to work with us to get it all plugged in and up and running. So for a new software HVAC, optimization kind of a tool, we think that's pretty good. And he's been really happy. He hasn't seen any hot and cold calls since Comfy started, and that's generally been the case for the other facility managers we've worked with. So yeah, generally it's been really rewarding. It's been a really positive experience so far for all folks involved. I think it's also been nice to hear that folks like the property managers, people who are trying to add value to their facilities, are interested in Comfy and are starting to see that as a value that they can add to tenants to help retain tenants and those kinds of things.
Excellent. Now, I guess, the one thing that we haven't talked about is what does it cost? I mean, what are we talking here? I mean, how does it get rolled out, for a building owner?
Yeah, sure. So we're doing one thing. This is a little experiment we've just decided to try where we are offering people to install Comfy in 20,000 square feet of space or less, or roughly around there, for 6 months for $10,000 as a sort of a flat fee for basically installation, all the service, a little nice evaluation at the end that tells you sort of what impact it's had on your building in terms of energy and all those things. So that's sort of an initial thing that we do just to get people to try it. It's generally priced as a service, so it is a sort of a software as service model where people will pay a service fee over time. But we can be flexible about that. If people want to sort of pay a larger chunk up front and just do a longer contract or something like that, we can do all those kinds of things. That's fine. But ultimately, Comfy is really a service. As I mentioned before, we have teams who are kind of talking to occupants and making sure they're comfortable and tweaking little things to make the space better for them. And that's really what we see as sort of is our goal, is to get everyone in the space comfortable and to use Comfy to do that, but also to kind of follow up with the personal touch whenever it's really needed. So it's I guess I'll say it depends on the size of the building, on the size of the space, but it's between 1 and 4 cents a square foot per month as the service fee.
All right. Fantastic. So, Lindsay, we're coming to the end of our time here. Any final last words, anything that we didn't cover, anything that you want to say?
No, I'm just really excited thanks for having me on, and it's fun to talk about everything. If anyone wants to get in touch with me, they can definitely find us on the website. GoComfy.com works and BuildingRobotics.com works. And hopefully we'll see folks around in the future. We'll be at AHR and Greenville this year, so stop by and say hi. All
right, excellent. Well, thank you so much for being on the show, Lindsay.
Thank you.
All right, and we're back. Thanks again to our guest, Lindsay Baker. Much appreciated for her time that she, out of her busy schedule, to sit down and talk with us. So much about this product kind of resonated with me. I know that in some aspects, we talked about during the interview about how maintenance people tended to forget or really didn't pay attention sometimes to resetting cold complaints, hot complaints. But it's not only the building maintenance people, users who have in fact have their own control. Change thermostats and then forget it. It's not human nature to have it always be on the top of your mind. You just want to be comfortable. I mean, at the end of the day, that's really what's important. But what was happening in this one particular case was that the people would change the thermostat and say they were cold in the morning when they came in, so they changed the thermostat so they were really, really hot. And then they came back from lunch and they were really hot. And the room was hot, so they cranked it all the way down. The thermostat had two settings, like cold, hot, and that's really the only thing that they understood, because they wanted to take it to the extreme to get it as cold or hot, whatever kind of was what they wanted at the time, and then they would forget about it. So what would end up happening is that after lunch, and they wanted it cold, they crank it all the way down and to get it cooler, and then they leave for the day and they'd forget about it, and it would be cooling. It would be working so hard all the way around until the next morning when they came up. And guess what? The room was cold. They were cold. They cranked it up, and the cycle started again. So really what Lindsay and the product there is kind of handling is the fact that, it really is kind of trying to smooth out and eliminate all these changes that are happening with the building set point. Other thing that I'd like to point out is I guess don't underestimate the fact that if somebody's hot and cold and the comfort issues. I mean, obviously, the number one cost for any owner in a space is the salaries of the employees that they have working for them. And it doesn't take much. I mean, in my own personal space at work, 3 degrees, 4 degrees. If you get a thermostat that's not quite right and it's not quite controlling and it's just a couple degrees off, and then you add a couple more degrees for it not being able to cool properly. Anywhere from just kind of not only just not complaining, but not being able to focus. You don't realize sometimes what it takes to really focus on something. To really be able to focus on what you're working on. All right, get off my soapbox. That's it. Hey, everybody, thanks for listening. I really appreciate it. If you want, sign up for my newsletter, reading list, notices, everything like that. It's going out. Look for buildingx.co is the website, and it should be right there on the upper right-hand side. So sign up for that. You'll get all sorts of notifications. Obviously, if you like this episode, pass it on. If you had any comments about it, send it to me. You can email me at matt@buildingx.co. Also, Twitter, if you're interested in that. Contact me on LinkedIn. And that's about it. I appreciate each and every one of you listening. I appreciate the time that you take, and hopefully this was something that was beneficial, at least something that was a little bit more eye-opening, a little off the beaten path. So until next time, remember, know what you build and share what you know.